Everyone. So today I wanted to talk about the importance of knowing whether mental health treatment is right for you or not. Knowing whether the type of mental health treatment that you're getting is making you feel better or making things worse for you, or if it's just not having any effect. Um, this is going to be very individual, knowing whether treatment is right for you or not. And I want to emphasize that doing something it is possible for mental health treatment to make you feel worse if it's not right for you, the same way that that can happen with treatment that is physical that's not right for you. I knew somebody who needed to get physical therapy because they had a problem with their elbow, but when they did the exercises that they were told to do, they found that their elbow was hurting even more. And when that person went to talk to the physical therapist about it, their physical therapist said, "Oh, oops, sorry, I gave you a sheet with the wrong exercises. Those were the exercises for a different problem than what you have, and they will make you worse." Another example is diet, for example. I know somebody who is on a very specialized diet for a health problem that they have, and a lot of the foods that they can't eat because it'll aggravate their health problem are fruits and vegetables and foods that for most of us would be healthy, would have a lot of nutrition. But for that person, those fruits and vegetables can cause problems. So the same is true with mental health. And I just wanted to emphasize that. And I wanted to talk about an example of when I was told to stick with treatment that was not right for me, even when I had rock solid evidence that it was making me feel worse. So, sorry, just looking at my notes here. Um, I was in DBT, which is dialectical behavior therapy. And although some of it was helpful, some of the skills were helpful to me. In general, a lot of it was making me feel worse. And there was one summer I was in a DBT class where we were asked to make this special type of pros and cons list about using DBT skills versus doing something harmful. Now, before I explain this, I just want to talk a little bit about how this type of pros and cons list works. So, this is a type where you have four different categories. Like, for example, let's say that you got a job offer, a new job, and you had to make a choice between, do I take this new job offer or do I keep the job that I already have? The way this model works is that you would list out the pros of taking the new job, the cons of taking the new job, the pros of sticking with your old job, and the cons of sticking with your old job. So there are four things. So we were supposed to make that type of a list about whether it was better to stick to do something that was harmful. We called it a target behavior, but I'll just say a harmful behavior versus using DBT skills that we learned in class instead. Now, when I've made pros and cons lists like this, I like to add this component of making it a weighted pros and cons list. So each line item that I list as a pro or con, I like to give it a value between 1 and 10 based on how important it is to me. Because really, I think you kind of need to do that in order to have a proper pros and cons list, because you could have one thing that is so important to you that that is more important than a bunch of different smaller things. So it's not about how many things you have listed, it's about how important they are to you. So I've always done that with pros and cons. I think it's more helpful that way. So when I was making this list on doing, and for my own privacy and for the safety of anybody watching, I'm not going to say what the harmful behavior was that I was doing, just because it's kind of private to me, and also because I just don't want to be encouraging it to anybody else who's watching. So I was making a list of the pros and cons of doing the harmful behavior and the pros and cons of using DBT skills instead. And I used my system where I gave each of them a value of points between 1 and 10 so that I could kind of add up the score and see what was more important to me. So when I did this and I brought it to the DBT class, I didn't show the list to everybody, but I told them the points. I got The pros of doing the harmful behavior, I got 29 points. The cons of doing the harmful behavior, I got 63 points. The pros of doing DBT skills instead, I got 53 points. And the cons of doing DBT skills instead, I got 59. So, what that means is that the only thing that was significantly lower are the pros of doing the harmful behavior. The pros and cons of doing the harmful behavior were very clearly there were way more cons than pros. We got 29 versus 63. That's like almost half. So that made it pretty clear that it was better to not do the harmful behavior than to do the harmful behavior. But when we look at the DBT skills, the pros and cons of doing the DBT skills were about even and slightly higher cons. We're talking 53 points for the pros of doing skills and 59 for the cons. So it's slightly worse to do DBT skills for me than it was to not do DBT skills because it was actively harming me doing the skills. And I think it's also worth looking at that the cons were about even. The cons of doing the harmful behavior were 63, but the cons of doing DBT skills were 59. That's very close. That's almost the same. So there's practically no difference in terms of what are the harmful effects of doing the harmful behavior versus what are the harmful effects of using skills instead. I think that's pretty telling. Like, if I were just looking at that, I would say to myself, based on those numbers and based on what was written there, okay, clearly we've established that it's bad to do this harmful behavior, but also clearly DBT skills are not the solution. That's what the numbers show. It's objective. So I told this to the group leader of my DBT class. And she told me to alter the data to see if I got a different result. Now, I understand that this is not an empirical study, this is self-reported, but if you've taken Psych 101 and you've taken research methods and statistics like I have, I was a psych major, you don't alter the data to get the result that you want. The data you get, you have to work with that. It can be interpreted different ways. Your interpretation might be right or wrong, but you don't say, let's manipulate the data until we get the result we want. Um, that there was nothing wrong with my pros and cons list. There wasn't anything, the fact that it came out that doing DBT skills was harmful to me was accurate. It was harmful to me, and I had evidence in numbers, and I was told to alter that. One thing we learned in class was that when you're making a pros and cons list, a suggestion was to label things as short term or long term, whether the pros and cons were things that were short term or long term. Um, so I was told to go back and do that. And I said to, which is fine, but I said to the therapist, that was built in. Like when I went through each of these things and ranked them on how important they were to me, whether it was a short term or a long term positive or negative effect, that was built into how important it was. And I verified that afterwards. When I went home and looked at the point system, I said, yeah, this is very clearly the things that were going to have a really big long term impact. I rated as more important than the things that were more of a short term impact. So I told her that was already built in. And I think what I did in terms of building that in, but also talking about how important they were to me individually is more important and more effective at looking at the data than just labeling things as long term and short term. You know, um, so that's one thing. And another thing is I was also told, she also said, maybe you're focusing too much on the numbers. Like maybe you should just sort of look at it without looking at the numbers. And it's like, okay, if I look at this without the numbers, the results are the same. because if I look at both of the lists of cons, they're equally long lists and they're equally bad things. Like, if you read what I said about the cons of using skills, there were a lot of things that were harming me in a really bad way, just as much as the harmful behavior. And looking at that, it actually was clearer that the skills were harming me if you drop the numbers, because it's clearer that both of the cons lists were the longest and most involved. The pros of using skills weren't so much about skills as they were just like a sort of flip side of the cons of doing the behavior. Like, the pros of skills were more about the fact that I wasn't doing the behavior versus being about the skills actually being helpful. So looking at what was written instead of focusing on the numbers made the evidence even more clear that there's a problem here. And I don't understand why I would be told to alter the data instead of looking at it objectively for what it is. If this were something other than DBT skills, like let's say, for example, somebody was doing a harmful behavior and they were told, instead of doing that harmful behavior, why don't you take a yoga class, for example? Yoga will help you to de-stress and it'll help with this issue that you're having. And the person did the pros and cons list for, is it better for me to do this thing that's harmful, or is it better for me to take a yoga class? If they got the results that I got, uh, I would say to them, it looks like it's very clear that it's better for you to not do the harmful behavior, but it looks from this like you don't like yoga. And yoga is just one thing. There are lots of things that you can do instead of a harmful behavior. There are lots of things that can help you to de-stress, or to, whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish with that harmful behavior. There are lots of other ways to do it, and yoga class is just one thing. You have infinite choice. There's so many things you could do. So that's what I would say to the person. Like, I would say, let's just find another alternative. And I would say, what is it that you don't like about yoga class? Maybe it's, you want something that's more active, or maybe it's not even a physical thing that you're looking for. Maybe you'd rather do like art or play an instrument, or just or maybe that's not the issue. Maybe what you need is more community. Like, there's just so many things that could be an alternative to a harmful behavior, that to just pick one, it just doesn't make sense, because those aren't the only choices. And in the case of a yoga class, I feel like it's very obvious because we think of that as just one thing. But in the case of therapy skills, I really feel like we were acting as if that was the only choice in the world. And that in itself is kind of a cultish behavior, to behave like this is the only solution, that there isn't a way to say, hey, yes, I want to stop this harmful behavior, but DBT skills are not the answer. There's infinite choice. There are other things you can do besides therapy skills. I don't feel like that was clear or understood. And and the other thing is, I was very clear on my pros and cons list, because when I explained what I was getting out of the behavior, and when I explained why the skills were making it worse, I feel like I was being very, very clear about what it was that I actually needed, what it was that I was getting out of the harmful behavior, that we need to look at getting that some other way, and skills were taking me farther away from that. And so I just want to share that experience, and I just want to let you know that if you ever find that something that everyone else is telling you is going to be helpful, including trained professionals, you need to know on your own whether it's helping or harming you. And it is okay to walk away from something that is making you feel worse. The fact that it might be slightly better than doing something else that was harmful doesn't mean that you have to stay. In my case, the cons were about the same. Like, the negative effect of just being on my own doing this behavior versus doing DBT skills was about the same. So I just wanted to talk about that and to say, don't let anybody tell you to alter your data. Don't let anybody tell you to try to rethink about it in a way that will give them the result that they want. You know in your heart what's right and wrong for you. I had rock solid, very detailed evidence, and I was told to disregard that evidence and try to see it in another way that would make it so that DBT skills were the answer when they weren't. So I just would encourage all of you to know yourself and to make sure that you stick with what's right for you, not let somebody else tell you what's right for you.